they're constantly trying to portray Australia as the worst offender. You wrote a splendid piece in this week's Spectator magazine where you correctly highlight that while our politicians are intent on impoverishing our country by pursuing net zero emissions, China, Russia and India are doing nothing. So David, while they grow stronger, we become weaker, don't we?
We do indeed, and you must wonder what our politicians are up to. Some of them we know from what they do after they've been in politics, and there were one or two even doing it while they were in politics. They are looking for very well-paid positions with foreign powers, with corporations which come from foreign powers. But it is very difficult to understand how they, in conscience, in good conscience, do these things, because the intelligent ones must realise that what they are doing is going to lead to a complete disaster in this country. We're going to have such excessive costs that is going to damage what's left of industry in the country, and then they'll move on to agriculture. We are really in a difficult position, and they're still prepared to allow the sale of our fossil fuels to those who are preaching to us and saying that we're doing terrible things.
Yes, well, meanwhile, China continues to prosper and grow. China, just so our viewers are aware, China is responsible for almost 30% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, and it's rising. Australia, as you say, David, is responsible for about 1%, and that's actually declining. Our politicians like Chris Bowen and Matt Keane, with the support of their respective leaders, are rushing to close coal-fired power stations and have no plans to build a new one. Yet China has over 1,000 coal-fired power stations and hundreds more planned. David, is this an act of betrayal by our government?
I think it is an act of betrayal, and they're even doing worse than the Germans did. The Germans foolishly did what Trump told them not to do. That is, they became even more dependent on the Russians for gas. But at least when they closed down the coal-fired power stations, they didn't blow them up, which is what's happened in Australia. They've closed down the power stations, and they've rendered them useless, so that when eventually we realise, politicians realise that they've got to be opened again, they'll have to rebuild them, which is a terrible thing that they've done.
Well, they're forcing us into renewable energy, aren't they? We're talking battery storage and all these other green schemes. As you correctly wrote in The Spectator, quote, what journalists should be asking Mr. Albanese is, when will his policy, for which we are already paying and will pay so much more for far less reliable electricity, result in no floods and no droughts? David, if these sagacious politicians know everything about the relationship between energy production and the weather, why can't they explain it to us?
It is extraordinary that they can't. The unfortunate thing is that the mass media is not prepared to interrogate them properly on these things. For example, when we had the Prime Minister talking about net zero emissions and speaking in the Pacific about climate emergencies and this being the most important issue, why didn't they ask the Prime Minister, why didn't they say to him, well, surely when you're speaking to your Pacific Island colleagues, surely you should be asking them why they aren't protesting about what the Chinese government is not doing in the field of renewable energy, because the communists in China are, as we all know, going heavily into coal-fired power stations. They're doing all the sorts of things, and as you rightly said, they're responsible for almost 1/3 of the emissions of the world.